Shocking confession shattered a 32-year marriage. Lies and an old flame. You never think it'll happen to you. When people talk about betrayal, about cracks forming in the foundation of their life, you listen politely, maybe even empathize, but deep down you think, that's not me. That's not us. My wife, James, and I have been married for 32 years, and for most of that time, I truly believed we had it all. Ours wasn't just a marriage. It was a partnership, a friendship, and, at least as far as I knew, a love story that had stood the test of time. We met in college, back when things were simpler. She was this sharp, funny woman who always knew how to command a room, and I was just this guy who couldn't believe someone like her would even talk to me. We started as friends, sitting together in the library during study breaks, sharing notes, and cracking jokes that didn't always land. Somewhere along the way, between coffee runs and late-night talks, friendship turned into something deeper. James and I didn't rush into things. We spent years building a foundation before we got married, and even then we talked about everything. Our goals, our fears, what kind of life we wanted to create together. We built that life piece by piece, raising 2 kids. A son, now 29, and a daughter, 26, who, I'd like to think, grew up in a home filled with love, stability, and warmth. Our friends used to joke about how we were the gold standard for marriage. They'd say things like, if James and Nate can't make it, no one can. And honestly, I believed them. We were that couple, the ones who finished each other's sentences, who could argue without ever crossing the line into cruelty, who still held hands when we walked through the park. Even as the years passed, and life got busier, we never seemed to lose touch with each other. Sure, there were challenges, kids to raise, bills to pay, careers to manage, but we tackled them together. I worked long hours in finance, and James balanced her job at a nonprofit with keeping the household running smoothly. We made time for date nights, trips, and lazy Sundays. There was something unshakable about us, or so I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if I missed the signs. Maybe I didn't want to see them, or maybe there truly weren't any. Life has a way of feeling perfect until the day it doesn't. It's strange how hindsight works, how the moments you once saw as ordinary start to take on a different hue. Like the way James would spend a little extra time on her phone some evenings, smiling at something I couldn't see. Or how she started working out more, saying she just wanted to feel healthier. I didn't question it. I was proud of her, happy she was taking care of herself. Even now, I hesitate to blame myself for not noticing. James was always so present, so engaged. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays, who knew exactly how to make our family feel loved and cared for. Our kids adored her. Our friends admired her. And I trusted her completely. I can't tell you when things started to change because, to me, they hadn't. At least not in any way I could put my finger on. Life was steady, predictable, comfortable. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I got too comfortable, too sure of what we had. But the truth is, there wasn't some big red flag, no glaring warning sign. If there was trouble brewing beneath the surface, I didn't see it. Not until the moment it all came crashing down. It was supposed to be a fun evening, one of those rare opportunities to step back in time and remember the people we were before life got so busy. James and I were attending our 40th college reunion, a milestone that felt both surreal and a little intimidating. The campus looked different, but the memories came flooding back the moment we stepped onto the grounds. It felt strange to see the faces of people we hadn't thought about in decades. All of them a little older, a little grayer, but unmistakably familiar. The event itself was as chaotic as you'd imagine. Hundreds of people crammed into a banquet hall, laughing, reminiscing, trying to talk over the hum of conversation and music. Name tags were stuck to lapels, as if we needed them to remember who we were all those years ago. James, of course, was in her element. She had always been the social one, the one who could slip into any room and make it her own. I hung back, content to let her shine while I stuck to the edges of the crowd, sipping my drink and catching up with a few old friends. Every now and then, I'd glance over and see James surrounded by a group of people, laughing that easy laugh of hers that always drew others in. It felt good to see her like that, to be reminded of the person I fell in love with all those years ago. But then Robert appeared. I hadn't thought about Robert in years, and even when I did, it was with a sense of distant amusement. He was part of James' past, a footnote in the story of our lives. Back in college, he had been infatuated with her. Everyone knew it. He wasn't shy about his feelings, either. He'd openly confessed them to her, even though he knew she was with me. It caused a bit of drama back then, but James had brushed it off, assuring me that I was the one she wanted. Seeing him now, though, was unexpected. He hadn't changed much, at least not in the ways that mattered. He still had that same self-assured air about him, the kind of confidence that borders on arrogance. His hair was thinner, and he carried a little more weight around the middle, but the way he carried himself, you'd think he hadn't aged a day. I spotted him before James did, weaving his way through the crowd with the ease of someone who knew exactly where he was going. My stomach tightened as I realized his destination. He was heading straight for her. "James!" he called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. She turned, and for a split second, I saw something in her face that I couldn't quite place.
Surprise?
Recognition, maybe even a hint of something else. "Robert," she said, her voice warm but careful. He embraced her like they were old friends, his arms lingering just a second too long. I watched from a distance, unsure of whether to intervene or let it play out. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more a sense of unease, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. They started talking, their voices lost in the cacophony of the room. At first, I tried not to let it bother me. It was harmless, I told myself. Just two people catching up after decades apart. But as the minutes stretched into longer moments, I couldn't help but notice how animated their conversation had become. Robert leaned in closer, his hand brushing her arm as he spoke. James laughed at something he said, that laugh I knew so well. I told myself it was nothing. I reminded myself of the life we had built together, the years of trust and love that had carried us this far. But there was something about the way they interacted that made me feel like an outsider, like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see. Eventually, I decided to join them, stepping into the space that felt like it had somehow closed itself off from me. "Robert," I said, extending a hand. "It's been a long time." He turned to me, that ever-present smirk on his face. "Nate," he said, gripping my hand with a little too much force. "It's good to see you." The three of us stood there making small talk, but the energy had shifted. James seemed distracted, like her attention was still focused on Robert, even when she was answering my questions. By the end of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Maybe it was just the strange dynamic of seeing an old flame reappear after so many years, or maybe it was something more. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, a part of me wondered if the perfect life we had built was as unshakable as I thought. Robert wasted no time making his intentions clear. From the moment he approached James, it was as if I wasn't even there. He had this way of leaning in when he spoke to her, his voice low, like they were sharing secrets meant for no one else. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw the way James reacted, the flicker of surprise in her eyes, the awkward laugh that followed. At first, I thought she was just being polite, caught off guard by his forwardness. But as the night wore on, it became harder to ignore. At one point, I watched him lean in close, whisper something in her ear. She blushed, shaking her head as if to dismiss whatever he had said. But there was something about the way she smiled, nervous, hesitant, that made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing. James wasn't the kind of person to let someone like Robert get under her skin, especially not after all these years. And yet, a little while later, I realized they were gone. I'd been talking to an old classmate, trying to keep up with the whirlwind of conversations around me, when I looked up and saw the spot where James and Robert had been standing. Empty. My eyes scanned the room, moving from group to group, but they were nowhere to be found. At first, I didn't panic. The venue was large, and the night was chaotic. They could have stepped outside for fresh air or wandered into another part of the building. But as minutes turned into an hour, I couldn't help but feel a knot of unease forming in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she ran into some other friends. Maybe Robert was just being overly friendly, catching her up on all the things he'd been doing since college. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to ignore the questions swirling in my mind. Where was she? When James finally returned, nearly 2 hours later, her demeanor was different. She was quiet, her usual warmth replaced by a kind of distant unease. She walked up to me, barely meeting my eyes, and said, "Let's go home." I blinked, caught off guard. Home? Already? It's still early. "I'm tired," she said, her voice firm but soft, almost like she didn't want to be challenged. "I don't feel well. Can we just leave?" I hesitated, searching her face for some kind of explanation, but she avoided my gaze. Her hands were fidgeting with the strap of her purse, her shoulders tense. "Okay," I said finally, trying not to let my confusion show. "Let's go." The ride home was uncomfortable, to say the least. James stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I wanted to ask her what had happened, where she had been, why she seemed so different, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she kept her eyes fixed on the darkness outside, or the way her foot tapped nervously against the floorboard. When we got home, she went straight to bed without another word. I sat in the living room for a long time that night, staring at the blank TV screen and replaying the evening in my head. I thought about Robert, the way he had whispered in her ear, the way they had disappeared together without a word. It wasn't like James to act this way. She was always so composed, so open about everything. But now there was this wall between us, and I couldn't figure out where it had come from. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that maybe she really wasn't feeling well, or that Robert had said something upsetting, and she just didn't want to talk about it yet. But as I sat there in the silence of our home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And for the first time in 32 years, I felt like I didn't know my wife at all. That night felt like it stretched on forever, each second heavier than the last. James had gone straight to bed as soon as we got home, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts. I sat there in silence, staring at the empty walls, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But it wasn't. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The questions, the unease, the sense that something was horribly wrong. It all pressed down on me until I couldn't breathe. I made my way upstairs, pausing outside our bedroom door, my hand hovering over the handle. I told myself to stay calm, to approach this rationally. But the moment I walked in and saw James sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands, everything I'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. "James," I said, my voice trembling. "What's going on? Where were you tonight?" She didn't look up. For a moment, I thought she was going to ignore me, but then her shoulders started shaking. At first, I thought she was laughing, some kind of strange, dismissive reaction, but then I heard the soft sound of her sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's when my heart stopped. I stepped closer, my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. "Sorry? What are you talking about?" She finally lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and puffy. I'd never seen her like this before. So raw, so broken. Scared me. "It's Robert," she said, her voice cracking. She stopped, choking on her words, and shook her head. I felt like the ground was falling out from under me. "What about Robert?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She took a deep, shuddering breath, like she was trying to steady herself, but her words came tumbling out in a mess of emotions. I made a mistake, Nate. A horrible mistake. Tonight, at the reunion, when we left the room, I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear. But Robert and we kissed. The room started spinning. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You kissed him," I repeated, my voice hollow. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't just that. He made me feel, I don't know, like I was young again, like I was important. And I know it's not an excuse, but I've been feeling so off lately, like I'm not myself. He saw that and he used it against me. He manipulated me, Nate. I know he did." I stared at her, the woman I had loved and trusted for 32 years, and I didn't recognize her. "Manipulated you?" I said, my voice rising. Are you seriously trying to put this on him? You're the one who left the room with him, James. You're the one who let it happen. She flinched at my words, her face crumpling as fresh tears fell. I know, she said, her voice shaking. It's my fault. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. I don't know why I didn't. The weight of her confession hit me like a freight train. 32 years of marriage, of memories, of trust. It all felt like it had been shattered in an instant. Do you have any idea what you've done? I asked, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. Do you even understand what this means? She nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the bed so tightly her knuckles turned white. I do, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I know I've ruined everything. I hate myself for it, Nate. I hate what I've done to you, to us. I turned away, running my hands through my hair as I tried to process what I just heard. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, but all I could do was stand there, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Why? I finally asked, my voice breaking. Why would you do this? After everything we've been through, after everything we've built together, how could you throw it all away? She shook her head, her tears falling harder. I don't know, she said, her voice cracking. I wasn't thinking. I was overwhelmed, and he said all the right things, and I let myself believe them even though I knew it was wrong. I don't have an excuse, Nate. I don't. All I can say is that I'm sorry. Her words felt hollow, like they weren't enough to fill the gaping hole that had opened in my chest. I need time, I said finally, my voice flat. I can't do this right now. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. Take all the time you need, she said. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Nate. I promise. But as I walked out of the room and closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was anything left to fix. I couldn't stay. After James' confession, the walls of our home felt like they were closing in on me. Every room, every piece of furniture, every photo on the walls. All of it felt tainted, like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. I couldn't sit in that house and pretend that things were normal, not after she'd shattered the foundation of everything we'd built together. I stayed up most of the night, pacing the living room, replaying her words over and over in my head. I wasn't thinking. He made me feel important. I hate myself for it. They didn't bring clarity, only more questions. How had this happened? How had the woman I trusted most in the world allowed something so destructive to take root? When the sun finally started to rise, I made up my mind. I needed to leave, to get out of that house and away from the suffocating weight of her betrayal. I couldn't think straight with her just down the hall, her presence a constant reminder of what she'd done. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started packing, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my toiletries, my laptop. Felt surreal, like I was moving in slow motion. Part of me kept expecting her to come out of the bedroom, to beg me to stay, but she didn't. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. When I was done, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the life I was leaving behind. The family photos on the walls, the souvenirs from vacations we'd taken, the little trinkets and reminders of a life that had once felt so solid, so secure. Now it all felt meaningless. I left without a word. The first thing I did after checking into a nearby hotel was block her number. I couldn't bear to hear from her, to read her apologies or explanations. It was all too raw, too painful. I blocked her on social media, too. Just the thought of seeing her posts, or worse, seeing her trying to act like nothing had happened, was unbearable. For the first time in 32 years, I was alone. The next few days were a blur of anger, sadness, and confusion. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with Robert, heard her voice as she confessed. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to stop the storm of emotions that was tearing me apart. Word got out to our kids sooner than I expected. James must have told them. I wasn't in the right headspace to explain what had happened, and I wasn't even sure how I would have started that conversation. My son, David, was the first to call. He sounded stunned, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Dad," he said, his voice hesitant. Mom told us what happened. Is it true? It's true, I said, my voice flat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I don't know what to say, he admitted. How could she do something like this? You were perfect. I let out a bitter laugh. I thought so too. David took my side almost immediately, though I could tell he was struggling to process it all. He'd always looked up to James, admired her for her strength and grace. To hear that she'd betrayed me, and by extension our family, shattered something in him. I'm so sorry, Dad, he said. I don't even know how to make sense of this. Are you okay? I'm managing, I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. My daughter, Emma, was a different story. She didn't call me. Instead, she texted a short, clipped message. Mom told me what happened. I don't know what to think right now, but I love you both. Please don't make me choose sides. That stung more than I expected. I didn't want Emma to take sides. I wasn't trying to pull our kids into this mess. But the fact that she couldn't bring herself to call, that she seemed to be leaning toward neutrality, left me feeling more alone than ever. David, on the other hand, made it clear where he stood. If you need anything, Dad, anything, just let me know, he said. And if you want me to talk to Mom, I can do that too. Try to make her see what she's done. No, I said quickly. This isn't your burden to carry. It's between me and her. The next few days in the hotel were agonizing. The silence was oppressive, but it also gave me too much time to think. Every memory of James played in my mind like a cruel film reel, the good times taunting me with what I thought we had. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The life I'd known was gone, and I wasn't sure if I could ever get it back. A few weeks passed, and the storm inside me didn't calm. It only grew. The betrayal gnawed at me like an open wound, refusing to heal. I couldn't look at photos of our family, couldn't think about the life we built without feeling the sharp sting of what James had done. Every time I replayed her confession in my head, it felt like another piece of me was breaking apart. I tried to give myself time to think, to decide what I wanted. But the more I reflected on it, the more I realized that what James had destroyed couldn't be repaired. It wasn't just the act of cheating, it was the trust, the bond, the respect. 32 years of marriage, undone in a single night. One morning, as I sat at the small hotel desk, staring at the divorce forms I'd printed the day before, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't feel calm exactly, but I felt certain. This was the only way forward. James had made her choice, and now I was making mine. Filing for divorce was simpler than I expected, almost unnervingly so. I dropped off the papers, signed where I needed to sign, and left the courthouse with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Felt final, like closing the door on a chapter of my life I wasn't ready to say goodbye to. James didn't take the news well. The first time she called, I ignored it. She left a voicemail, her voice trembling. Nate, please, can we talk? I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I know we can. Just call me back. I didn't. Over the next few days, her attempts to reach me grew more desperate. Texts, emails, even handwritten letters that she must have dropped off at the front desk of the hotel. Each one was more pleading than the last. I'm begging you, Nate. One of her messages read, don't do this. We can work through it. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Please don't throw away what we have. But to me, it wasn't me who had thrown it away. It was her. And there was no coming back from that. When the divorce papers were finally served, James broke. I heard about it through David, who had been checking on her despite his anger over what she'd done. Mom's not doing great, he told me during one of our calls. His voice was heavy, laced with guilt and worry. She's barely eating. She just sits in the living room all day, staring at the wall. She told me she never thought it would come to this. She thought you'd forgive her. I closed my eyes, the words hitting harder than I wanted them to. She thought wrong, I said quietly. David hesitated. I get it, Dad. I do. But she's still Mom. David, I said firmly. I love you, and I understand that this is hard for you, But what she did, it broke something in me. I can't go back to the way things were. She has to live with the choices she made, just like I do. He didn't argue, but I could tell he wanted to. Meanwhile, Robert, her knight in shining armor, revealed his true nature. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that he had disappeared almost immediately after the reunion. He hadn't returned any of James' calls or messages, leaving her with nothing but the hollow realization that she had destroyed her marriage for a man who had no intention of staying in her life. Robert used me, James admitted to David during one of their conversations, according to what he later told me. He said all the right things, made me feel like I mattered, and then he was gone. I was such a fool. Hearing that didn't bring me any satisfaction. If anything, it made me feel worse. She had thrown away our life together for a fantasy, a fleeting moment of attention from someone who didn't care about her the way I had. It was pathetic and it was heartbreaking. Over time, James' depression deepened. Emma, who had remained neutral throughout everything, stepped in to try and help her, but even she struggled to get through. She's not herself, Emma told me during one of her calls. She's just empty. I think she blames herself for everything. I don't know if she'll ever recover. Part of me wanted to reach out, to ease her pain, but I couldn't. Every time I thought about her, I remembered that night. Her confession, her betrayal, the way she'd let Robert pull her away from me. Forgiveness felt impossible, no matter how much I wanted to move on. As the divorce process continued, I found myself focusing on rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back. James had made her bed, and now she was lying in it, alone. And as much as it hurt to see her like that, I had no choice but to walk away. After the divorce, everything felt like a blank slate. A terrifying, overwhelming blank slate. For the first time in decades, I had no one to answer to, no plans that revolved around someone else's needs or schedule. It was disorienting at first, waking up each morning in the silence of a hotel room or temporary apartment. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized that silence could be freeing. I decided to do something I'd always talked about, but never had the time or courage to follow through on: travel. It started small. A weekend trip to a nearby city, just to get away and clear my head. But as I stood on the balcony of that first hotel, looking out at a skyline I'd never seen before, something inside me shifted. I wanted more. I began planning trips further and further away, dipping into my savings for experiences I'd always thought would be someday goals. Someday had arrived, and I wasn't going to let it pass me by. In the span of a year, I visited over a dozen countries. I wandered the cobblestone streets of Prague, hiked the fjords in Norway, and stood in awe of the pyramids in Egypt. Each place offered a sense of renewal, a piece of myself reclaimed from the ashes of the life I'd left behind. Then, in Japan, everything changed. It was my third night in Kyoto, and I was sitting at a tiny izakaya tucked away in an alley, enjoying a plate of yakitori and a glass of sake. The place was quiet, mostly locals chatting softly, their laughter blending with the faint hum of traditional music playing in the background. That's when I noticed her. Ashley was sitting at the bar, flipping through a guidebook and scribbling notes in the margins. She looked like she belonged there, effortlessly blending into the cozy atmosphere. But what caught my attention wasn't just how she looked. It was the way she seemed so completely at ease, like she'd made peace with the world in a way I hadn't yet figured out how to do. I must have been staring, because when she glanced up and caught my eye, she smiled. Not the kind of polite, obligatory smile you give to a stranger, but a warm, genuine one that made me feel like she could see right through me. "First time in Japan?" she asked, her American accent cutting through the gentle hum of the room. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Yeah, you," she laughed softly. "Second. The first time was different. This trip is for me." We started talking, and before I knew it, the hours had slipped away. Ashley told me about her own journey, how she'd left a toxic marriage a few years ago and had been traveling ever since, rediscovering herself one country at a time. There was a quiet strength to her, a resilience that I recognized because it mirrored my own. We ended up spending the rest of our time in Kyoto together, exploring temples, sampling street food, and talking late into the night. By the time we parted ways, she was heading to Osaka and I was off to Tokyo. It felt like I'd known her for years, but that wasn't the end of it. We stayed in touch, texting and calling as we continued our separate travels. Eventually, those separate paths converged. We started planning trips together, meeting in new cities and discovering the world as a team. It's been 2 years now since that night in Kyoto, and Ashley has become my constant companion. We visited more than 15 countries together, from the beaches of Thailand to the mountains of Peru. Traveling with her has been different from traveling alone. Better, in so many ways. She doesn't just share my adventures. She enhances them, bringing her own perspective and excitement to every new experience. We're not in a hurry to tie the knot, and I think that's part of why it works so well. After everything we've both been through, we understand the importance of taking things slow, of letting our relationship grow naturally without the pressure of labels or expectations. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living. Really living. My past is still there, a part of me that I can't erase, but it no longer defines me. I've built something new, something good, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Ashley likes to tease me about how reluctant I was to step out of my comfort zone. If I hadn't smiled at you in that izakaya, she'll say with a laugh, you'd probably still be sitting there, staring at your plate. Maybe, I always reply, but I'm glad you did, and I mean it. For all the pain and heartbreak that brought me to this point, I wouldn't trade where I am now for anything. The world is wide and beautiful, and for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to see where it takes me next. For years after the divorce, life had finally settled into something that felt like peace. I had built a new life with Ashley, filled with travel, laughter, and a kind of quiet contentment I hadn't known I needed. My relationship with my kids had also healed in its own way, though the wounds left by James' betrayal hadn't entirely faded. When David announced he was getting married, I felt a wave of emotions I hadn't expected. Pride, of course. Seeing him step into this next chapter of his life filled me with joy. But there was also a pang of something deeper, something bittersweet. The wedding would mean seeing James again. I knew it was inevitable, but I wasn't looking forward to it. The day of the wedding was beautiful. David and his fiancée had chosen a rustic outdoor venue surrounded by rolling hills and tall oak trees. The air was warm, the kind of perfect late spring day that feels like it was made for celebrating. Ashley and I arrived early, taking our seats near the front of the ceremony space. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I watched David stand at the altar, his face lighting up when he saw his bride walking toward him. He looked so happy, so confident, and in that moment, all my worries about the past faded away. This was his day and nothing else mattered. But then, during the reception, I saw her. James was standing near the bar, dressed elegantly in a soft blue dress that suited her. She looked different. There was a weariness to her, a kind of sadness etched into her features that hadn't been there before. I could see it even through her practiced smile as she chatted with some relatives. It wasn't long before she noticed me. Her eyes landed on Ashley first, and I saw the flicker of recognition in her expression. Ashley, as always, was effortlessly radiant, her laughter ringing out as she talked to David and a group of his friends. When James turned back to me, her face softened, her posture hesitant. I knew she was going to approach before she even took a step. "Nate," she said quietly, stopping a few feet away. "James." I nodded politely but kept my tone neutral. She hesitated, glancing toward Ashley before looking back at me. I was hoping we could talk, just for a minute. I sighed, already knowing where this was going. "James, this isn't the time or place. This is David's day, and I don't want to make it about anything else." "I know," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. I need to say this.
I'm sorry, Nate.
For everything. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did. If I could take it all back, I would." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the weight of all those years, all that pain, pressing against my chest. But then I glanced at Ashley, who caught my eye and gave me a warm, reassuring smile, and I felt steady again. "I've moved on, James," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "That part of my life is over. I found peace, and I hope you can too." She blinked, as if she hadn't expected me to be so final. "You really have, haven't you?" she said, her eyes flicking toward Ashley again. "Yes," I said simply. James nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm glad," she said after a moment, though her voice carried a hint of sadness. "You deserve it." With that, she stepped back, giving me one last, lingering look before disappearing into the crowd. The rest of the night passed without incident, and I made sure to focus on what really mattered, celebrating David and his new wife. They looked so happy together, dancing under the string lights with the sound of music and laughter surrounding them. My kids, I knew, were still navigating their relationship with their mother. David had been cordial to her, but there was a distance there, a lingering hurt that hadn't fully healed. Emma was more forgiving, but even she seemed to keep James at arm's length. "I know it's complicated," David said to me later that night when we found a quiet moment to talk, "but I just want you to know, I'm proud of you, Dad, for how you handled everything, for being here, for being you." I smiled, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Thanks, son. I'm proud of you, too. You've got a good thing going here. Don't let it go." "I won't," he said, his gaze drifting to his new wife, who was laughing with Emma across the room. As the night wound down, Ashley and I found ourselves on the dance floor, swaying gently to a slow song. She rested her head on my shoulder, her hand warm in mine. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the music. "Yeah," I said, pulling her a little closer. "I'm more than okay." And I was. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my life was exactly where it was meant to be. The past was behind me, and the future, whatever it held, was mine to embrace.